The Candyman murder. 35 years later, memories of notorious Halloween Candyman murder remain vivid. You might think Mike Hinton's anger had ebbed in the 3.5 decades since, a young Harris County Assistant District Attorney, he was assigned to prosecute Ronald Clark O'Bryan, the father accused of poisoning his own son's Halloween candy. Or that, in the 25 years since O'Bryan was executed by the state of Texas, Hinton would prefer to let the past dissolve into receding memories. You'd be wrong, though. I never get tired of talking about that sorry-ass son of a bitch, said Hinton, today an attorney in private practice in Houston. Ever since he convinced a jury that O'Bryan deliberately murdered 8-year-old Timothy by placing cyanide-laced pixie sticks into his trick-or-treat candy, the clarity of Hinton's recollections has not faded, but rather resolved into sharper focus. He remembers tiny details of the case, he said, just like it was last night. Such as when, in a near-empty courtroom during the trial, O'Bryan, later dubbed the Candyman, turned to him and offered a Tootsie Roll. And how, on the night of O'Brien's execution, March 31st, 1984, Hinton returned to his childhood home in Amarillo, took a boat out on the lake, and lifted a Miller beer in silent celebration as he floated in the darkness. Flick the right switch and vivid images still scroll in front of Hinton's eyes, particularly when late October rolls around. He sees the dead boy's slight body on the autopsy table. So young, he said, choking up, so young. Hinton is not the only one haunted by the memory of the crime that spooked generations of Halloween trick-or-treaters. Tom Campbell was a young news reporter for a Houston television station when he was assigned to cover the O'Bryan trial. Today, as an anchorman for a television station in Augusta, GA, he's had no better luck outrunning his memories. To this day, I don't observe Halloween, he said. Every year, as daylight fades on the final day of October, he has kept the porch light at his home off and refused to answer the door. When the station's annual party gets underway this year, he'll slip out as he always does. I can't do this, he tells himself again. Ripples from the real-life tale of Halloween horror have touched millions more, though many people today may not realize it. In 1979, when Ronald O'Bryan appealed his death sentence, Clyde DeWitt represented the government. O'Brien's lawyer was Marvin Teague, who 2 years later would be named a justice on the state's Court of Criminal Appeals. Teague died in 1991, but DeWitt vividly remembers the defender's opening statement. As you know, Teague began, my client was convicted of killing Halloween. Now an attorney in Los Angeles, DeWitt recalled that pressing for O'Brien's death sentence was complicated by his criminal record, or more accurately, lack of one. This guy had never had anything but a parking ticket in his life, he said. So how did the evidence support that he wasn't capable of rehabilitation? Most of those who learned the details of O'Brien's actions, however, agreed that his single transgression was more than sufficient to merit the ultimate punishment. I have seriously mixed emotions about the death penalty, DeWitt said, but if this doesn't justify the death penalty, then there never will be a case that does. I just can't think of a more reprehensible crime. The events of that evening, 35 years ago tonight, later described in court documents and newspaper accounts, appeared straightforward, if appalling. After a dinner with friends, Ronald O'Bryan, still dressed in the white optician's lab coat he wore at work, and neighbor Jim Bates headed out for an early evening of trick-or-treating. It was raining. With them were 3 children, a Bates boy and O'Brien's 2 children, Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth. At one of the homes they visited, no one answered the door. While the children ran ahead to the next house, Ronald O'Bryan stayed behind. When he caught up to the group, he was holding several giant pixie sticks, colored paper straws stuffed with powdered sweetener. You must have some rich neighbors, he told Bates. He gave one to each of the children. Back home, Timothy asked to eat some of his candy before bed. He selected the pixie stick. When he had trouble pouring the powder into his mouth, his father rolled the straw between his palms to loosen it. After pouring the candy into his mouth, Timothy complained that it tasted bitter. O'Bryan gave him some Kool-Aid to wash the taste out. Timothy began vomiting almost immediately. Within minutes, he was convulsing. His father called an ambulance. Bill Lanier had been detective with the Pasadena Police Department for less than a year when he caught the O'Bryan case. It was his first murder investigation. Now retired and living in Louisiana, Lanier remembers the case vividly, beginning with his arrival at the hospital. Timothy was dead on arrival, so Lanier went to work interviewing members of the O'Bryan family. Ronald O'Bryan, who 2 weeks earlier had celebrated his 30th birthday, was a big guy, but he talked soft, almost feminine. He had a real hang-dog look, the detective recalled. He wasn't crying or bawling or anything, but there was no reason to believe he was involved. Lanier and several other Pasadena detectives quickly fanned out, recovering 4 other pixie sticks. One had been clutched in the hand of a child who'd fallen asleep after failing to open the straw, which was stapled shut. Others were recovered from the Bates children and Timothy's sister, who also had yet to eat them. Lab tests showed that the top 2 inches of each straw had been packed with a fatal dose of cyanide. Over the next couple of days, police tried to pin down the house where O'Bryan had received the poison candy. O'Bryan's recollections were oddly imprecise. At first he kept saying, "I don't know what home," then "I don't know which street," Lanier said, but the only trick-or-treated on 2 streets. Then he said he didn't see the person. All I could see was an arm. After methodically walking up and down the neighborhood several times with the cops, O'Bryan finally directed them to a house. It was owned by a man named Courtney Melvin, who O'Bryan said was the person who gave him the deadly candy. "Bad choice," Ronald C. O'Bryan Hinton said in a recent interview. It turned out Melvin hadn't gotten home until nearly 11 p.m. on Halloween night. The guy had an ironclad alibi, Lanier said. He was a shift worker, a supervisor at a hobby airport. He had more than 200 people who could vouch for him. Meanwhile, the detectives were uncovering more troubling information about O'Bryan. He'd recently sold the family's home to cover mounting debts. He still owed money to numerous creditors. He'd also purchased a $20,000 life insurance policy on each of his children a month earlier. In addition to policies he'd acquired for them the previous January, Halloween fell on a Thursday. On Friday at 9 a.m., just hours after his son's death, Ronald had called to inquire about collecting the policies. The more questions the police asked, the more suspicion fell on O'Bryan. The summer before, he had called an acquaintance who worked for a chemical company and asked him questions about cyanide, including what constituted a fatal human dose. Just before Halloween, he entered a Houston chemical outlet and asked about buying some of the poison, leaving after he learned that the smallest package available was 5 pounds. Even after being confronted with the growing evidence against him, O'Bryan never confessed, Lanier said. "He came close. I got him right to the line. An interrogation typically goes through stages. First, there's denial. Then you can see the subject give up. With O'Bryan, I seen that give up. We'd been in the interview room for a while, and he slumped and started nodding his head like he's agreeing with me. I said, 'Now's the time to tell me,' and he nodded some more. So I waited a couple of minutes. When he didn't say anything, I said, 'Ronald, tell me.' And he said, 'Tell you what?' And the moment was gone. He never got there." Police never identified where O'Bryan brought the cyanide either, and during his trial, O'Bryan maintained his only son, had been poisoned by an anonymous monster. But the jury took less than an hour to convict him. His initial appeal was denied in 1979. Not only did he kill his son for money, the judges noted, but O'Bryan intended to commit other murders to do so, when he intentionally distributed the 4 additional poisoned pixie sticks to other children. The likely and predictable result of his acts was to cause their deaths also. The horrific death of Timothy O'Bryan would prove to be a singular crime, the only deliberate Halloween poisoning fatally ever documented, said Joel Best, a sociology and criminal justice professor at the University of Delaware, who has studied supposed instances of October 31st, candy poisonings and reported attempts to harm trick-or-treaters. Yet he added the case had a kind of echo chamber effect. Unproven rumors of strangers playing deadly Halloween pranks on children had been circulating for decades, and O'Bryan probably calculated that they would serve as a cover for his crime, Best said. And while Timothy's poisoning was neither random nor anonymous, the resultant publicity confirmed parents' anxieties about stranger danger. In the days after Timothy O'Bryan's death, the police measured that fear in towering piles of candy. People were scared to death, Lanier recalled. "We put out the word. If you have any suspicious candy or if anything looks strange, bring it to us." We wound up with a whole room full of candy. People didn't go trick-or-treating around here for years. It was amazing how well publicized the trial was, Hinton said. There were reporters from London and Germany all over. Even today, it's still talked about. I think it changed Halloween. O'Bryan's wife, Deneen, steadfastly maintained she was unaware of her husband's plans. She divorced O'Bryan soon after testifying against him in court. She later remarried and still lives in the Pasadena area. Timothy's younger sister, now 40, has managed to put the incident behind her and raise a family, Hinton said. Ronald O'Bryan's lawyers tried to save his life up until the last moment, but their appeals failed. The former optician agreed to donate his eyes for research and cataract transplants. After a final meal of well-done steak and Boston cream pie, O'Bryan was injected with the then new lethal cocktail of drugs considered more humane than electrocution or cyanide gas. He was declared dead at 12:48 a.m. When news of O'Bryan's death reached a group of observers who'd gathered for the occasion outside the Huntsville prison facility, they cheered and they yelled, "Trick or treat."